He built an empire on bones. He ruled 1,000,000 wolves through terror and blood. And when fate handed him the one woman the ancient laws said was his mate, his equal, his other half, he looked her in the eyes and threw her away like garbage. Because he was afraid. The mightiest alpha who ever lived, afraid of a woman whose eyes held a white flame he'd never seen before. This is the story of what that fear cost him. Watch until the end, hit that like if this hits different, and drop your city name below. I want to know where my wolves are watching from. Posit. The morning of the convergence ceremony smelled like blood and pine resin. Kaelor Draven stood at the highest window of the Iron Citadel and watched the delegations arrive through the frozen courtyard below. 23 noble houses, 40 lesser packs, 3 contested border lords who hadn't decided yet whether to kneel or die. They all came in the same way. Wolves flattened, chins down, eyes cutting sideways at each other because looking straight at him meant something they weren't ready to commit to. He'd built that. Every inch of that fear he'd built with his own hands over 19 years of war. He didn't feel anything watching them come in. That bothered him more than he let himself admit. "The Valor delegation arrived before dawn," said Ronan, standing 2 steps behind him, his war captain, the only man alive who spoke to him in full sentences without rehearsing them first. They requested the eastern guest quarters instead of the northern wing. Lady Selene Valor leads the party personally. No male escort. Kaelor said nothing. "That's unusual," Ronan added. "The Valor bloodline hasn't sent a woman to court ceremony in 4 generations. House records say she specifically requested the audience with you." "She can request whatever she wants." Kaelor turned from the window. His reflection briefly caught in the black mirror on the wall. He didn't look at it. He hadn't looked at his own reflection in 3 years. Ever since the last border war left a scar running from his left jaw to his collarbone that hadn't healed clean. Wolves healed from everything. That scar stayed. He'd stopped wondering why. What's her bloodline status? Confirmed White Wolf lineage. 3 generations back, diluted. Mostly ceremonial at this point. Ronan paused. But she has the coloring. Full white. Eyes as well. A party trick for noble gatherings. Maybe. Ronan's voice stayed neutral in that specific way that meant he thought Kaelor was wrong and was calculating whether it was worth the argument. She's also unmarried at 24. No betrothal contracts. No pack affiliation. She's been running the Valor territory alone since her father died 18 months ago. Alone. Alone. Kaelor pulled on his gauntlets, black iron set into hardened leather, the knuckles worn smooth from use. They were functional, not ceremonial. He'd stopped wearing the decorative war armor 3 years ago when he realized the weight was slowing him down and the fear his reputation generated was doing the work the armor used to do. Then she's either desperate or she's playing a longer game than her house can afford. He walked out without saying which one he thought it was. Peten. The Convergence Hall held 400 wolves standing. They were standing now. They stood because chairs implied comfort, and comfort implied a relationship with the Alpha King that precisely none of them were owed. Kaelor walked the central path from the iron doors to the raised stone platform at the far end, and he felt every set of eyes in the room track him without daring to hold. 40 feet of silence, broken only by the sound of his boots on the flagstone. He'd walked this path 100 times. He knew the exact moment, 20 feet in, when the air in the room changed, when the collective wolf instinct in 400 trained fighters recognized apex predator, and every nervous system in the hall told its owner to go absolutely still. He stepped onto the platform and turned. "House Aldrich." The First Lord stepped forward and spoke his oath. Kaelor watched his hands while he did it. Hands didn't lie the way faces did. House after house came forward. The ceremony was exact and ancient and took 3 hours, and he ran it without notes because the words were carved into him by now, the same way his father had run it before him, and his grandfather before that, back through 7 generations of Draven kings who had bled and killed to hold this empire together with wire and threat. Somewhere around the 14th house he felt it. It was subtle enough that he almost filed it under the ambient cold of the hall, a change in air pressure, a pull at the back of his sternum that had no physical source. He'd felt it 3 times in his life before. Once during a battle where the tide turned before he could see why. Once in the moment before a knife came out of shadow toward his throat. Once when he was 7 years old standing in a doorway watching something he'd spent the rest of his life trying to forget. His wolf went rigid. He kept his face still. kept his eyes on the Lord, currently swearing loyalty, and processed the words and gave the correct formal response and filed the response under automatic and put the rest of his attention on the sensation spreading through his chest like the first crack in river ice. Something was here that hadn't been here before. Something had arrived. House Valor. He didn't know which moment he'd been waiting for until it was already happening. She walked out of the gathered crowd from the east side of the hall, and she walked alone. No escort, no herald, just her own footsteps and 30 feet of open stone floor between her and the platform, and every wolf in the room turned to look at her with the specific, helpless attention given to things you couldn't not look at. She was white, not pale, white, the absolute colorless quality of new snow or stripped bone, and it wasn't weakness. Her hair ran loose past her shoulders and moved with the cold air from the high windows, and her eyes, when they found his face across the distance, were the gray of a sky about 2 minutes before a storm breaks open. She wore the Valor colors, deep blue, silver trim, but the formal cut of her coat was simple in the way that things are simple when the person wearing them doesn't need decoration to establish presence. She walked like she knew exactly where she was going. She stopped at the base of the platform steps and met his eyes without the downward cut. Just held his gaze, direct and steady, while the silence in the room stretched out 2 beats longer than the ceremony required. Lord Kaelor Draven, she said. Her voice was controlled. Low register for a woman, not performing. House Valor presents itself before the Empire and acknowledges your sovereign authority over these territories. She extended her hand, the formal gesture that required him to step down from the platform and take it, the physical acknowledgement of receipt that completed the oath bond. He stepped down. He reached for her hand. The moment his fingers closed around hers, the world cracked open down the center. He had no other word for it. It wasn't pain. It wasn't pleasure. It was something older than either of those things, something cellular and ancient and overwhelming that started at the point of contact and moved outward through his hand and up his arm and into his chest, where it hit the sternum like a concussive blow and then spread, burning, through every nerve he had. His wolf didn't just respond, it lunged forward with a recognition that had nothing learned in it, pure animal, pure certainty. He saw her absorb it too. Her face went very still in the half second after contact, and her eyes changed, the gray going lighter, almost white, something igniting behind them that she hadn't put there deliberately. Her hand gripped his back. Not a defensive grip, a reflex. He released her hand. He stepped back onto the platform. He looked at the hall. 400 wolves were watching him with the careful attention of people who had just watched something happen that they didn't fully understand but instinctively knew mattered. House Valor, he said, and his voice came out level. He'd controlled harder things than this. He'd sat through interrogations with broken ribs and run battlefield commands with arrows in his shoulder. He controlled his voice now. Acknowledged. She held his gaze for 1 more second. Then she inclined her head and walked back into the gathered crowd, and the ceremony moved forward. He felt her in the room for every remaining minute of the next 2 hours. Like a brand pressed against the inside of his rib cage. There, precise and unwavering, tracking her position without his permission. That night he sat alone in his war room for 4 hours and thought about what it meant and didn't like any of the answers he came up with. The formal dinner occupied the East Hall and ran late because the Border Lords wanted face time they hadn't earned, and Kaelor gave it to them anyway because strategic patience was cheaper than another 2 months of military positioning. He moved through the room with Ronan at his shoulder and said the right things and ate nothing and drank 1 cup of wine over 3 hours because he needed his head clear. She was across the room. He knew where she was without looking. He'd known since she walked in. He looked anyway. She was seated at the end of one of the long tables between a minor Aldrich heir who was talking too much and an older Valor steward who was watching the room the way stewards did when they were worried about their charge. She was listening to the heir talk. Her expression was composed. Her hands rested on the table, left hand, right hand, still. She wasn't performing enjoyment. She wasn't performing anything. She just sat there present and contained, and he could feel the bond radiating across 50 feet of crowded room like heat off a forge. "She's looking at you," Ronan said very quietly, beside him. "I'm aware." "The bond?" Kaelor didn't answer. Ronan was quiet for a moment. Then, "What are you going to do?" "Nothing." Kaylor? I said nothing, Ronan. He said it quietly because he always said important things quietly, but Ronan went still the way he did when he recognized the specific timbre in Kaylor's voice that meant the conversation was over. Not because the king was angry, because the king had already decided. Kaylor crossed the room. She looked up when he was 10 feet away and didn't look surprised. He stopped at the edge of the table and looked at the Aldrich air until the air registered the proximity and went silent mid-sentence and developed urgent business elsewhere. The steward stood. Kaylor looked at him, and the steward looked back and then made the same calculation the air had made and stepped back 2 paces. Kaylor sat down across from her. She waited. Celine Valor, he said. Alpha King, she said. You requested this audience. I did. For what purpose? She tilted her head. It wasn't a coy gesture. It was the movement of someone considering whether the framing of a question tells you something more interesting than any answer would. My father's death left the Valor holdings without formal standing within the Empire's compact structure. I came to negotiate terms. You could have sent a representative. I could have. She held his gaze. Up close, her eyes were more complex than the hall had let him see. The gray layered and shifting, some quality in them that kept pulling focus the way motion did. I chose not to. Why? Because I wanted to meet you. He was quiet. That surprises you, she said. Not unkind, observational. Nothing surprises me. The corner of her mouth moved, not quite a smile. You felt it, she said, low enough that only he could hear it. When we touched, during the ceremony. The sentence sat between them. I felt the formal acknowledgement of a house oath, he said. No, you didn't. He looked at her. She looked back. The bond sat in his chest like a coal, not burning hot, just present, constant, there. And she clearly felt it too. He could see it in the particular stillness of her face, the way people go still when they're managing something powerful. The White Wolf bloodline is 3 generations diluted, he said. Is it? House records indicate house records were written by people who had reasons to write what they wrote. She said it simply. My bloodline is what it is. I've known what I was since I was 16 years old and shifted for the first time, and my entire pack fell to their bellies without knowing why. He studied her face, looking for performance, finding nothing but the thing she was actually saying, which was that she wasn't afraid of him, which was either the most foolish thing anyone had said to him in years, or, what do you want from this conversation? He asked. She met his eyes directly. I wanted to see what kind of man you are, before I decided anything. And what have you decided? She was quiet for a long moment. That you're more afraid than you've let anyone see in a very long time. She said it without cruelty, just the flat calm of someone stating observed fact. And that you've built an entire empire as a wall between you and whatever it is you're afraid of. The room continued around them. Noise, wine, the elaborate theater of wolf politics. Kaylor sat across from a woman who had just said the most accurate thing anyone had said to him in 19 years, and kept his face very still. You should be careful, he said, about what you say to me. I know what I'm saying. She held his gaze. I'm also not afraid of you. I think you should know that now, so we're starting from the same point. He stood up. Your territorial holdings will be reviewed and formalized through the standard compact process. My steward will contact yours within the fortnight. He looked down at her. Enjoy the rest of your evening, Lady Valor. He walked away. He felt her watching him go. He felt the bond stretching across the distance between them like a wire pulled taut, and it did not slacken, and he could not make it stop. And that night in his war room alone, he sat for a long time in the cold and dark, and told himself it didn't matter, and could feel, with perfect clarity, that he was lying. She was still in the Citadel 3 days later. She had every right to be. The compact negotiations were legitimate and complicated and required actual time to work through properly. Kaylor conducted 2 of the 4 required sessions himself, which he didn't have to do but chose to do, and told himself it was because the Valor holdings covered a strategically significant river passage, and that was the entire reason. She negotiated like someone who had run her own affairs alone for 18 months and knew it. No performance of uncertainty. No deference beyond the formal minimum the ceremony required. She'd read every prior compact agreement her house had signed, knew where the language had been disadvantageous, and came to the table with specific counterlanguage already drafted that addressed the gaps without overreaching. He respected it. He didn't say so. He felt her the whole time. 3 days of the bond sitting in his chest like a compass needle, always knowing her direction, always knowing she was within the citadel walls, always knowing, pointlessly, irritatingly, that she was 200 feet to the east and 3 floors down. On the third evening, he found himself standing in the eastern corridor for no reason he could justify. She was coming down the corridor from the other direction. She stopped when she saw him. He stopped when he saw her. They stood in the empty hallway 12 feet apart in the guttering light of the wall torches, and neither of them said anything for a long moment. "You've been avoiding me outside the negotiation sessions," she said. "I've been running an empire. You've been avoiding me." He looked at her. She was wearing something simpler than the ceremony clothes, practical travel wool, her hair pulled back. She looked like someone who had been sitting up late doing paperwork, which she probably had been. She looked completely real in a way that made the bond in his chest pull with a sharpness that he had been 3 days trying to dull. "What do you want, Celine?" She walked toward him, slowly, stopped 4 feet away, close enough that he could feel the warmth off her skin, close enough that the bond stopped being a general pressure and became something precise and localized and almost unbearable. "I want to know if you're going to do something about this," she said, "or if you're going to spend the rest of your life running." "I don't run from anything. You've been running from this since the moment you felt it." Her voice wasn't accusatory. It was direct the way hard facts are direct. "I felt it too. First touch. Both of us. Simultaneous. That's not diluted bloodline. That's not a party trick. You know what that is." It's a biological response to proximity between Kaylor. His name in her mouth stopped him mid-sentence in a way nothing had stopped him since he was a child. She looked up at him, all that gray storm color in her eyes, and spoke plainly. "It's the bond. You know it is. I know it is. Pretending otherwise is costing both of us energy we could use for something real." He looked down at her. He wanted to say something brutal, something that would end this and end it cleanly, and let him go back to the empire that he understood, the empire made of war and calculation and things that didn't do whatever this was to his chest every time she stood close. He ran through the words and found them and opened his mouth, and then he reached out and touched her face. He didn't plan it. His hand moved before the decision did, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw with a gentleness that didn't belong to any version of himself he'd operated as in the last 19 years. And she turned her face slightly into his hand and closed her eyes, and the bond erupted through him with a force that nearly took his footing. He pulled his hand back, stepped away. She opened her eyes and looked at him with the careful composure of someone who had just felt the same thing he had. "I need to think," he said. "I know," she said. He walked away. His hand felt different from the rest of his body for the next 4 hours. Not painful. Just alive in a way that didn't go away. Ronan found him on the citadel wall at midnight. The north wind was cutting and the stars were out over the frozen steps, and Kaylor stood with his forearms on the stone and looked at the nothing in the distance and breathed through it. "She's leaving in the morning," Ronan said, stopping beside him. "The compact agreements are signed. There's no formal reason to extend the stay." Kaylor said nothing. "I've been your captain for 9 years," Ronan said. "I've watched you make every decision I've ever seen you make, including the bad ones." He paused. "This is going to be the worst one." "You don't know what I'm going to decide." "Yes, I do." Ronan's voice was even. "I know, because I know how you think, and I know what you're afraid of, and I know that the two things are about to combine into something you're going to spend the next 10 years regretting." "Her bloodline is a political problem." Kaylor kept his voice flat. "The White Wolf lineage has a claim on imperial legitimacy that predates the Draven Compact. If I formalize a bond with her, every house that wants a reason to challenge succession has one. Every rebel faction gets a cause. She's your mate. She's a political liability. Kaylor, I built this empire," he said, and he said it quietly because it was important, and he always said important things quietly. "I built it out of nothing after watching my father's pack tear itself apart, and my mother—" He stopped. Started again. "The empire stands because nothing gets in through the walls. Not grief, not sentiment, not biology." He looked at the dark horizon. "Not this." Ronan was quiet for a long moment. And if she's carrying, she won't be. He had heard the conversations, the bond, the contact. He knew what the old lore said about White Wolf convergence. He pushed it down. It was 3 days. Nothing happened. Ronan didn't argue it. That was the specific silence Ronan used when he thought arguing was useless, but also thought he was watching someone make a catastrophic error in real time. "What are you going to do in the morning?" Ronan said finally. Kaylor had known since midnight, maybe before. End it cleanly. Public session. Formal rejection. Dissolve the compact basis before it becomes rumor. That will break her. People don't break from one refusal. He believed that. He told it to himself in the specific voice he used for true things. She's strong enough. She'll move on. And you? He didn't answer. The wind came off the steps and cut against his face, and he let it. The morning session was called without notice. That was deliberate. Notice gave her time to prepare, to build an argument, to find the angles. He needed it done quickly and completely. He stood on the platform in the formal hall with Ronan and 2 senior lords as witnesses, and when she walked in and looked at him, he could see the moment she read the room, the set of his face, the formal arrangement. Her composure tightened slightly, and her chin came up, and she stopped in the center of the floor. "Lady Valor," he said. "Alpha King." Her voice was perfectly controlled. She was reading him, and he could feel her doing it, feel the bond responding to her proximity with that insistent living heat. And he kept it out of his face and out of his voice by doing the thing he'd been doing since he was 7 years old, which was to go to the cold place inside himself where nothing reached. "It has come to my attention," he said, "that the events of the past 3 days have given rise to certain assumptions. I'm addressing those assumptions directly and on the record." He held her gaze, owed her that at least. "The Valor Compact is signed and valid. House Valor retains full standing under the Empire's terms." Pause. "Any further assumptions of a personal nature between this throne and House Valor are formally rejected and dissolved. There is no bond. There is no claim. There will be no further contact beyond standard diplomatic channels." The hall was very quiet. She looked at him, and he felt the bond take the declaration like a blade, felt it through his own chest like the words were cutting into something living. Her face didn't change. That was the worst part. She didn't perform devastation. She just went very still and looked at him with those gray eyes, and he could feel through the bond what she was feeling and made himself stop feeling it. "Understood," she said. 2 syllables, perfectly level. "You're dismissed from the Citadel," he said, "effective immediately." Something finally moved in her face then, the briefest flash, not anger, not grief, something sharper and more total than either of those. A woman looking at a man and understanding something new and final about who he was. It lasted 1 second, and then it was gone. "Then I'll collect my party," she said, "and we'll be on the road within the hour." She turned and walked out. He stood on the platform and watched her go, and the bond sat in his chest like a wound that didn't bleed, and he told himself it would fade, and he believed it would fade, and he said nothing at all. She was gone by mid-morning. He stood at the same window he'd stood at when the delegations arrived and watched the Valor party move through the outer gate and north up the road, and he watched until the last horse disappeared into the tree line, and then he turned away and went back to work. The Empire had a border incident in the west that needed addressing. 2 houses in the south were moving troops toward a disputed hunting ground. A tax survey in the Central Territories had come back with numbers that suggested someone was skimming from the collection process. He worked. He worked through that day, and the next, and the next. And the bond did not fade. It receded, changed character. From that constant warm presence to something more like a low note you couldn't unhear, persistent and sourceless, a frequency under everything. He learned to function around it. He told himself that was the same as it fading. 3 weeks later, in the middle of a night campaign briefing with Ronan and his senior war council, he felt the bond do something it had not done before. It lurched. Not a physical sensation, something deeper than that. A pull, directional and sudden, toward the northeast, toward the frozen roads she'd taken north, sharp enough that he actually paused mid-sentence and had to recover himself. "Kaylor," Ronan said. "Continue," he said, and looked back at the campaign maps. But the sensation was still there. The bond, which had been receding, had just pulled in a completely different direction, changed character entirely into something he had no framework for, and was now doing something at the base of his chest that was less like a compass needle and more like something new, like something beginning. He didn't know what it was. He didn't ask. He told himself it was nothing. He went back to his war maps, and the new thing continued, quiet and persistent, in the exact direction Celine Valor had disappeared 3 weeks ago into the frozen north. 4 months later, a courier arrived from House Valor's northern steward with a compact renewal notice. Standard language. No personal content. Signed by a proxy in Celine Valor's name. She had not returned to any noble gathering since the morning she walked out of the Draven Citadel. She had not been seen publicly at all, and the bond, which every piece of wolf lore Kaelor had ever studied said should have been weakening towards severance, was doing the opposite. Growing, deepening, pulling northeast with an insistence that was starting to feel less like a connection between two wolves and more like a connection between three. He didn't have an explanation for that yet. In another 4 weeks he would, and by then it would be too late to undo what his pride had built. 3 years is a long time to watch an empire eat itself. Kaelor Draven stood in the war room and looked at the campaign map and did the math he'd been doing every morning for 18 months. The numbers hadn't improved. The western border was bleeding again. Not a clean military engagement, which he could have solved in 6 weeks, but the slow hemorrhage of a rebellion that wouldn't commit to open battle and so couldn't be answered with open battle. It scattered when he rode toward it and reformed when he rode away, and cost him 40 to 60 soldiers a month in skirmishes, ambushes, and the specific misery of fighting people who lived on the terrain and knew it the way his army never would. The South had the tax problem, which had metastasized from skimming into something structural, someone embedded deep enough in the collection apparatus to redirect entire district revenues without leaving a clean trail. He'd put 3 investigators on it. 2 of them had stopped sending reports. The North was quiet, which was the most concerning thing of all. Lord Malrek wants the Eastern campaign decision by the end of the week, Ronan said from the doorway. Kaelor didn't look up from the map. Tell him he'll get it when I've made it. He's been waiting 6 weeks. Then he can wait 7. Ronan came into the room and stopped on the other side of the table. He looked at the map for a moment. Then he looked at Kaelor with that specific expression that meant he was about to say something Kaelor hadn't invited. The bond. Ronan, you look like you haven't slept in 2 weeks. 3 weeks, Kaelor said, without intending to. He looked up from the map. Ronan's face held no satisfaction at having gotten an honest answer, just the flat concern of a man who'd watched something go bad slowly and couldn't stop it. It's changed again. Changed how? Kaelor set down the stylus he'd been holding, stood back from the table. The bond had been doing something for the last 4 months that he had no framework for. That 3-way quality. The sense of something doubled where there should only have been one. He'd written it off as degraded perception, the bond severing unevenly. He'd read the lore, and the lore said bonds didn't sever, they faded. And maybe what he was feeling was the fade. But it wasn't fading. It's louder, he said. Ronan said nothing. It's not weakening towards silence, it's amplifying, and it's directional. Northeast, always northeast. He looked at the map, at the frozen roads running up toward the Valor territory, and past it, past the last compact borders, and into the wild northern reaches, where the pack boundaries dissolved into territory that nobody claimed and nobody patrolled. She went north. Yes. Past the Valor holdings. Her steward's proxy correspondence comes from the northern edge of her territories. No specific location. Ronan paused. We haven't tracked it further. Why not? Ronan looked at him steadily. Because you told me not to. Kaelor turned away from the map. He walked to the window. The Citadel courtyard was gray and cold below him, the early winter just starting to put frost on the stone. He breathed in the cold coming through the glass and tried to feel the bond clearly through the noise of 3 years of empire management, and found it immediately because it was always there, always exactly there, northeast, louder than last week, and now carrying that strange doubled frequency that something moved in him, something ancient and physical and not under his control. He turned around. Get me Malrek. Lord Malrek Voss was 43 years old and had been Kaelor's war advisor for 7 years. And in those 7 years, he had made himself genuinely indispensable, which was the most dangerous thing a man could make himself. He was narrow-built with a scholar's posture and a soldier's eyes, dark, quick, missing nothing. He walked into the war room and read the atmosphere in roughly 2 seconds and organized his face into attentiveness. Alpha King. The rebellion in the West, Kylor said. Tell me something new. Malrek came to the table. He didn't look at the map with the performed thoughtfulness that some advisors used. He looked at it the way he always did, directly, immediately, like he'd already thought about the question and was retrieving a filed answer. The Western cells are being coordinated. I've suspected it for 6 months. The scatter pattern when we advance is too clean for organic resistance. Somebody is reading our movements before we make them. Which means someone with access. Which means someone here. Malrek said it without inflection. I've been building a candidate list. It's slow work. Whoever it is, they're careful. He looked at Kylor. I'll have something concrete in 6 to 8 weeks. I want it in 3. Then I'll need more latitude. You'll have it. Kylor held his gaze. What else? Malrek's expression shifted, barely. Something coming forward that he'd been deciding whether to say. The Southern Revenue discrepancy. My own investigation, separate from yours. He reached into his coat and put a folded document on the table. I know who it is. Kylor looked at the document, didn't pick it up yet. Who? Lord Cassian Vorn, 2nd District Collector, Southern Compact. Malrek's voice stayed even. He has family connections to 3 of the Western rebel cell leaders. I believe the revenue is funding the rebellion directly. Kylor picked up the document. Read it. The evidence was there. Transaction records, correspondence intercepts, geographic patterns that mapped cleanly onto the rebel activity timeline. Clean work. Thorough. He looked up at Malrek. When did you have this? I've been building it for 4 months. I wanted to be certain before I brought it to you. 4 months. Kylor set the document down. Why not come to me sooner? Because you would have acted before the evidence was complete, and Vorn would have disappeared and we'd have lost the thread back to the Western cells. Malrek held his gaze. I made a judgment call. I believe it was correct. The logic was sound. The reasoning was the reasoning Kylor himself used. He filed the discomfort he felt at Malrek's independent timeline under the category of necessary advisor behavior and didn't let it change his face. I'll deal with Vorn within the week. What do you need to move on the Western Coordination Network? Authorization to access the Courier Archive. Full access, not filtered. Done. Kylor looked back at the map. I also want a report on the Northern Territories, specifically the unincorporated land north of the Valor Holdings. Pack activity, any new settlements, any patterns of unusual movement in the last 3 years. He felt Malrek go very still. It lasted less than a second. A professional stillness, the kind that most people wouldn't catch. Kylor caught it. He kept his eyes on the map. That's specific, Malrek said. His voice was unchanged. Any particular reason to focus there? I'm running an empire, Kylor said. The North being quiet is a reason. Of course. A beat. I'll have something for you. That's all. Malrek collected the document from the table and left. Kylor stood alone in the war room and thought about that single moment of stillness and what it might mean, and filed it where he filed things he wasn't ready to look at directly, and went back to the map. Ronan found him at the stables at dusk. Not because anything was scheduled for the stables. Kylor had simply needed to be somewhere that wasn't the war room or the throne hall, somewhere that smelled like horses and hay and cold work, and had walked there with the specific aimlessness of a man who had too many things in his head and needed to put his hands on something physical. He was brushing down his horse. The animal stood patiently under it. Kylor worked in silence. I made some inquiries, Ronan said, stopping at the stall gate. He said it like he was commenting on the weather. Kylor kept brushing. About what? About the North? Ronan paused. Not through official channels. Kylor stopped brushing. He looked at Ronan over the horse's back. I have a contact who runs supply routes up to the boundary edge, Ronan said. Old army man, owes me a debt. No reason to lie. Another pause, shorter. He says there's a settlement, 3 years old, hidden in the Ashfall Valley, north of the Valor boundary, off every map, off every courier route. He met Kaylor's gaze. He says the woman who runs it has white hair. The stall was very quiet. He says there are children, Ronan said. 2 of them. Twins. Around 2.5, maybe 3 years old. His voice was absolutely steady. He says the children have white hair too, both of them. Kaylor's hand was still on the horse's flank. He could feel the animal's heartbeat under his palm, steady and slow, completely indifferent to whatever was happening to the man standing beside it. Twins, he said. Yes. The bond did what it had been doing for 3 years. Pulled northeast, constant and insistent. And now he knew why it had doubled. Why it had been 3 frequencies instead of 2 for the past months. He knew exactly why, and the knowledge moved through him not as thought but as pure physical sensation, hitting his chest from the inside out. He'd rejected her. He'd made it public. He'd sent her north with nothing. No protection, no resources beyond whatever the Valor Compact covered. No acknowledgement, no truth. He'd stripped the bond of its name and called it nothing, and watched her walk out of his hall and told himself it would fade. She'd been raising his children alone in a hidden valley in the frozen north for nearly 3 years. She didn't tell me, he said. No, Ronan's voice was careful. She didn't. She should have. He stopped, hurt himself. Put the brush down and looked at the stall wall. She should have told him. She had every right not to tell him. Both of those things were true at the same time, and the space between them was the direct consequence of everything he'd decided 3 years ago in a midnight war room and called strategy. There's more, Ronan said. Kaylor looked at him. My contact heard something else on his last run 2 weeks ago. Campfire talk at a way station. Men moving north who weren't supply runners and weren't border patrol. Ronan kept his eyes steady on Kaylor's. He said they had the look of hired work. Armed, coordinated, not talking about where they were going. Direction. Northeast. Kaylor moved. Not a considered movement. Instinct. The wolf moving before the man processed the math, stepping out of the stall and heading for the stable door with a velocity that made Ronan step back. How long ago? Kaylor said. 2 weeks. Ronan was moving with him now. If they've been traveling hard, they're already there. He stopped walking. Stood in the stable doorway with the cold evening air hitting his face, and did the math. 2 weeks. Good riders pushing north in winter conditions. They were already there, or close enough to there that the difference was hours, not days. Who hired them? I don't know yet. Find out. He turned. Tonight, whatever you have to do. And you? He was already calculating what he needed, how many men he could pull and ride with and still move fast. How many days to the Ashfall Valley from here? What condition the roads north would be in at the front edge of winter? I'm riding north, he said. Kaylor, if you go yourself, she's out there alone with my children and someone sent assassins. He said it flat and hard, the way he stated campaign objectives. I'm riding north. Pick your best 20 and meet me at the outer gate in 1 hour. Ronan looked at him for a long moment, not arguing. Past argument now. Past the point where any version of Ronan's counsel was going to change what Kaylor's body was already committed to. Just looking at him with the expression of a man who had watched 3 years of bad decisions finally arrive at their consequence. 1 hour, Ronan said. I'll have 25. Kaylor was already walking. He rode out under a sky full of stars with Ronan and 24 soldiers and a feeling in his chest he hadn't felt since he was a child. Not the bond's constant pull, something rawer than that, something that didn't have a strategic name and didn't need one. He rode hard and let it be what it was, and didn't try to put walls around it. 2 days north of the Citadel, one of his advanced scouts came back at a dead gallop. The scout pulled up beside him on the road, horse-breathing hard, and said, Smoke, my lord. Northeast. Maybe 4 hours at pace. Coming up from a valley. Kaylor looked at the horizon. The faintest smear of gray against the dark sky, barely visible. Ride, he said. Oh. They reached the valley edge in 3 hours because he pushed the pace past safe and nobody argued. He smelled it before he saw it. Wood smoke and something sharper underneath. The specific scent of a fight, blood and torn earth, and the burned metal quality of wolves who had shifted hard under extreme stress. He crested the valley ridge and stopped. Below him, a settlement. Small, hidden, built into the tree line with the careful architecture of people who didn't want to be found. 3 buildings still standing, one on the south end burning, flames low and orange in the dark, and in the clearing between the buildings, bodies. 8 of them, armed, dead, and in the center of the clearing, a woman in a white wolf's form, standing over 2 small shapes with her back to the tree line and her head up and blood running dark across her shoulder where something had connected before she'd ended whoever threw it. She turned when she heard the horses on the ridge. He saw the moment she recognized him. Even from that distance, even in wolf form, he saw it in the change of her stance, the way she stepped forward and then stopped and then stepped forward again. Not toward him, away from the 2 small shapes behind her, putting herself between. He dismounted. He walked down the ridge alone, leaving Ronan and the soldiers at the top, because whatever happened in the next 5 minutes needed to happen without an audience. She shifted as he got close. Wolf form dissolving. Her standing in the clearing in torn clothes with blood at her shoulder and her white hair loose and her gray eyes watching him the way you watch something you can't afford to trust, even if part of you wants to, even if something in you is pulling toward it with a force that had no strategy in it at all. He stopped 6 feet away. She was breathing hard, not from fear, exertion, the deep uneven breathing of someone who'd just burned through everything they had and was running on the other side of the edge. Behind her, 2 small faces peered out from the shadow of the trees, white-haired, enormous eyes, watching him with an expression that was not afraid and was not welcoming and was something more complicated than either. Kaylor looked at them. He looked back at Celine. She was looking at him with 3 years in her eyes, 3 years of what he'd done and why she'd gone and what it had cost her and what she'd built out of that cost and what she was willing to do to protect it. All of it visible, none of it spoken, all of it sitting in the 6 feet of cold night air between them. "You need a healer for that shoulder," he said. "I've handled worse," she said. "I know." He looked at the bodies in the clearing, back at her. "I know you have." The twins moved. The smaller one, the boy, he thought, something in the bone structure, stepped out from behind his mother's legs and stood in the clearing with his feet apart and his white hair disheveled and looked at Kaylor with the specific, unimpressed assessment of a 3-year-old who had just watched his mother kill 8 armed men and wasn't sure the newcomer was an improvement. "Mama," the boy said. His voice was already somehow substantial for a child that size. "Who's that?" Celine didn't answer immediately. Kaylor looked at his son. His son looked back at him. "His name is Kaylor," Celine said, and her voice was absolutely level, giving the boy the truth without a frame around it, without the softening or the explanation, just the fact, and the fact sat in the burning clearing like a stone dropped in still water. The boy considered this for a long moment with the gravity that only very small children and very old wolves brought to important questions. "Does he know how to fight?" the boy said. "Yes," Kaylor said. The boy looked at him for another moment, then turned back to the tree shadow and said something to his sister in a low voice that Kaylor couldn't catch. He looked at Celine. She was watching him with something in her face that wasn't forgiveness and wasn't war, but was maybe the very beginning of a question she hadn't decided to ask out loud yet. "There will be more," she said. "Whoever sent these 8 will know they failed." "I know." He held her gaze. "That's why you're coming back with me." Her chin came up. "Not as a prisoner," he said before she could say the thing she was clearly about to say. Not the way it was before. But you're not safe here and I need to know who sent them, and until I do I can't protect you from 1,000 miles away." His voice came out rougher than he intended. "Let me—" He stopped. Started again. "Let me do this." She looked at him, at the bodies in the clearing, at the burning building, at the 2 children watching from the shadow, both of them looking at Kaylor now with matching expressions of cautious and unimpressed assessment that was so deeply familiar in its bones that it knocked something loose in his chest he hadn't known was still latched. "If you threaten my children," she said quietly, "for any reason, for politics or bloodlines or what their existence does to your succession math, I will burn everything you've built to the ground, and I will enjoy it." "I know," he said. She held his gaze for 3 more seconds. Then she turned and spoke quietly to the twins, and the girl came forward first, and then the boy, and they stood beside their mother and looked up at the big man who had arrived at the valley's edge with soldiers and whose name was Kaylor, and who appeared, on balance, to know how to fight. Ronan's voice came from the ridge above. My lord! Tight, urgent. Rider coming in from the south. Fast. Imperial seal. Kaelor looked up. It's from the capital, Ronan called. It's from Lord Malrek. A pause. He's made a declaration. The word landed in the clearing like cold iron. Kaelor looked at Celine. She looked at him. What kind of declaration, he said, though some part of him, the part that had filed Malrek's half-second of stillness in the war room and never fully unfiled it, already knew. Ronan's voice came down flat and grim. He's named you compromised, says you've been corrupted by forbidden bloodlines and abandoned the throne. Another pause. He's called the noble houses to a war council. He's moving on the capital. The burning building crackled. The twins were very still. Celine said nothing. She was watching him with those gray eyes that held 3 years of everything, and behind those eyes something had shifted. Not toward him, not yet, nothing that easy, but the calculation had changed. The question was different now. Whatever came next, they weren't facing it from opposite sides. The Empire was on fire, and the man who'd lit the match had been standing in his war room for 7 years. The rider's horse was half dead. Kaelor could see it from the valley ridge, the animal's flanks heaving, foam dried white along its neck, legs trembling on the frozen road with the specific mechanical quality of a thing that had been pushed past the point of choice into the territory of pure will. The rider himself wasn't much better. He'd ridden through the night from the capital, and it showed in every line of his body when Ronan's men brought him down into the valley. He was one of Kaelor's own couriers. Young, maybe 20. His face, when he looked up at Kaelor, held something that wasn't quite fear and wasn't quite grief, but lived in the thin, cold space between them. My lord, he said. His voice was wrecked from hard riding in winter air. Lord Malrek moved on the capital 6 days ago. The iron citadel's outer gates held for 2 days. He stopped, swallowed. The inner council surrendered on the 3rd day. 3 of the senior lords signed his declaration. Kaelor stood very still. Which lords? Ronan said. Aldrich, Fenner, Cassie. The courier's eyes stayed on Kaelor. Lord Malrek has declared a regency council pending your formal removal. He's calling it a protection of the Empire against contamination by forbidden bloodlines. The word contamination came out of the young man's mouth like he'd had to reach past something to say it. He has the garrison. He has the Eastern Army. And he sent riders to every noble house in the compact, calling them to ratify the declaration within 30 days. 30 days. Kaelor did the math without meaning to. 30 days to reach every house and collect a response was tight even in good riding weather, which meant Malrek had sent the riders before he moved on the capital, before the garrison fell, before the gates. The declaration had been written in advance. The riders had been staged. The timing had been orchestrated with the kind of patience that didn't arrive overnight. 7 years. He'd been in Kaelor's war room for 7 years. Get him water and food, Kaelor said, meaning the courier, and walked away from the group toward the edge of the tree line where the valley dropped off into frozen dark. He stood there for a moment, just stood, breathing the cold air in through his nose and out through his mouth, and letting the information settle into the structure of what he knew and what he'd missed and what he should have seen. He'd given Malrek the courier archive access 2 weeks ago. Full access, not filtered. He'd handed the man the keys to every communication channel the Empire used and called it good strategy. And Malrek had already been 6 steps ahead of that, had been 6 steps ahead for years, maybe from the beginning, and Kaelor had sat across the table from him and read the intelligence he brought and acted on it, and never once, not once in 7 years, had asked the question underneath the question. Who benefits from the wars staying long? Celine's voice came from behind him, quiet, not approaching, just present. How bad? Bad. The capital? Fallen. 3 senior lords have signed his declaration. He turned. She was standing 10 feet back with her arms crossed and her shoulder wrapped in field dressing that one of his soldiers had applied, the white of it standing out stark against her dark coat. The twins were behind her, both asleep now against each other on a soldier's bedroll near the fire one of his men had built. They'd gone down fast, the way children did after extreme events, the body deciding that sleep was the only available response to something the mind couldn't fully process yet. He's been building this for years. I know, she said. He looked at her. Not specifically Malrek, she said. But I knew someone close to you was feeding information about me, about the settlement. The men who came tonight, they weren't hired through normal channels. They knew where we were. We've moved twice in 3 years, and they found us both times. Her gray eyes were level. Someone with reach and patience and access to your intelligence network. You knew someone was hunting you. I suspected. And you didn't... He stopped. The sentence had no good ending. She hadn't told him because he'd made it definitionally impossible for her to tell him. He'd built that wall himself, stone by stone, over the 3 years he'd called silence a strategy. How long? 6 months. The first time we moved, I thought it was precautionary. The second time, I knew it wasn't. She held his gaze without accusation. Just facts, delivered flat. I was planning to move again in the spring. He looked at the twins sleeping by the fire. The girl was curled on her side with her fist under her chin. The boy had one arm thrown over his sister with the unconscious protectiveness of a child who'd learned early that some things needed guarding. Something moved through Kaylor's chest that didn't have a strategic name. He let it. Didn't try to put a wall around it because the walls had done their work, and here was the result. I need to get you somewhere defensible, he said, and then I need to take back my empire. In that order? In that order. She was quiet for a moment, looking at him with the careful assessment of someone deciding how much weight to put on a surface they weren't sure would hold. Where? The Valor Holdings, your northern edge, not the main house, the garrison post at Redfall. It's stone, high ground, defensible approaches, and it's not in any of Malrek's known intelligence from the archive because I never put it in the archive. He watched her face. It'll buy us time. Time for what? For me to figure out which lords haven't signed his declaration and how many are waiting to see which way this breaks before they commit. He looked at the dark valley, at the bodies his men were dealing with in the clearing, at the burning building reduced to low orange coals. Malrek is smart, but smart men build complicated structures, and complicated structures have more places to fail. She nodded. Once. Not agreement exactly, more like acknowledgement that the plan was the plan, and standing in a burned valley arguing the alternatives wasn't useful. We move at first light. At first light, he said. He turned back to the darkness, and she went back to the fire, and they stood in the same cold valley, not speaking, and the distance between them was different from what it had been 3 years ago. Not smaller exactly, just different in kind. 3 years ago, the distance had been a choice. Now it was a wound, and wounds, unlike choices, had to be worked through from the inside. They rode hard for 2 days with the twins bundled and the soldiers cycling watch, and Kaylor sleeping 2 hours out of every 24 in the saddle, which was a skill he'd learned during the Northern Border campaign a decade ago and never fully forgot. The boy, Soren, Celine had told him, quiet and without ceremony, just the name offered like a stone set in an open hand, rode in front of one of the soldiers on the second day, after refusing for the entire first day to be carried by anyone he hadn't personally assessed. He sat up straight with his white hair whipping in the road wind and watched the terrain pass with a focus that was unsettling in a child that size. Not afraid. Taking inventory. The girl, Lyric, rode with Celine, asleep for most of the first day and quietly observant for the second. She had her mother's eyes, that layered gray, deep and shifting. And she watched Kaylor with the particular attention of a child who has learned that new people in the environment are data before they are anything else. On the second evening, at the campfire, Kaylor was going through the courier's documents when he heard small feet on frozen ground behind him. He didn't turn immediately. He waited until the feet stopped, which they did, about 4 feet back, and then he turned. Lyric stood in the firelight looking at him. She was holding something, a small carved figure, rough wood, the shape of a wolf. Someone had made it by hand recently, the cut still pale where the wood was fresh. Soren made that, she said. He makes them when he's thinking about something. What's he thinking about? Kaylor said. She tilted her head with a directness that was her mother in miniature. You. She looked at the figure in her hand. He says you smell like the bond. Like Mama, but different. She looked up. I told him that doesn't make sense. What did he say? He said lots of things don't make sense, but they're still true. She considered this with the solemnity of a child reporting a peer's philosophy. He thinks like that. It's annoying. Kaylor looked at the carved figure. Can I see it? She looked at him for a moment, then stepped forward and held it out. He took it carefully. The carving was rough, but not random. The proportions deliberate, the wolf's stance recognizable. Aggressive, but not attacking, waiting. He turned it over in his hand. "Will you protect us?" Lyric said. He looked up at her. "Mama says we don't need protecting," she said. "She says that to make us feel strong, but I know the difference between what she says to make us feel strong and what is actually true." Her gray eyes held his steadily. "So I'm asking you directly. Will you protect us?" Kaylor looked at this child, his daughter, a fact his body understood entirely, and his mind was still constructing a framework around, and he thought about the 7 years he'd spent building walls against exactly this kind of question. Against anything that required a yes he couldn't control the consequences of. "Yes," he said. She nodded, like she'd been waiting to verify a piece of information and now had it. She reached out and took the carved wolf back from his hand, turned, and walked back to the fire and her brother without another word. He sat with the weight of that yes for a long time in the cold. Redfall Garrison sat on a granite outcrop above the tree line, 3 stories of black stone with sight lines that ran 3 miles in every direction on clear days. They arrived on the 3rd morning, and Kaylor's men swept it and declared it clear, and Celine walked the walls the way a commander would, checking approaches, checking sight lines, finding the 2 places where a climbing attack was theoretically possible, and stationing men there before anyone told her to. He watched her do it and said nothing. That afternoon, Ronan pulled him into the garrison's main room with the look on his face that meant the news had finished getting worse and arrived at something new. "I've been working the courier's documents," Ronan said. He put 3 sheets on the table. "Malrek's declaration has language in it I've seen before." He pointed to a specific passage. 7 years ago. In the report that triggered the Northern Border Campaign. The one that justified the push that eliminated the last 3 independent wolf clans north of the Compact Line. Kaylor looked at the language. Read it. "Same phrasing," Ronan said. "Contamination of imperial bloodlines. Protection of pack law purity. The same argument, 7 years apart, used to justify 2 completely different military actions." He paused. "I think Malrek has been running a version of this playbook since before he joined your council." "Since before?" "I think he came to you already running it." Kaylor straightened up, looked at the far wall, thought about Malrek's file when he'd first recommended him. Clean record, military intelligence background, a series of successful assignments under 2 previous lords, references he'd checked personally, a history that read without gaps, a history written to be read. He embedded himself, Kaylor said. "Yes, into my council, to run the wars longer, to keep the Empire fractured just enough that I needed him. Yes." Ronan's voice was even and careful. "There's one more thing." He put a 4th document on the table, older, the edges worn. "I found this in the archive materials the courier brought. It's from 12 years ago, a field report from a border engagement, one of the original Northern Campaign actions." Kaylor looked at it. "The engagement at Vale Ridge," Ronan said. "Quiet now. Very quiet. The one where your mother was killed." The room went completely silent. Kaylor looked at the document. It was a field report. Standard format, coordinates, casualty lists, the dry bureaucratic language of military record-keeping. His eyes moved to the signatures at the bottom. The standard sign-offs, the intelligence advisor who had provided the position data that placed his mother's convoy on that road that day. The signature was 12 years old. The handwriting was one he'd seen for 7 years across a war room table. He stood very still. His mother. She'd been traveling to negotiate a pact treaty with the northern clans, a peace process she'd been building for 3 years, the one his father had been skeptical of, the one that would have changed the entire architecture of the Empire's relationship with the North. She'd been on a specific road on a specific day, and the rebels who'd ambushed the convoy had known exactly where she'd be, because someone had told them where she'd be, someone with access to her travel plans, someone in an intelligence position 12 years ago. He'd been 7 years old. He'd stood in a doorway. He'd watched something that he'd spent the rest of his life turning into stone, because stone didn't bleed, and stone didn't grieve, and stone didn't make you weak the way the boy in the doorway had been weak, openly and completely, in a way he'd never allowed himself to be again. Malrek had killed his mother. He had spent 7 years sitting across a table from the man who killed his mother and calling him indispensable. Kaelor. Ronan's voice came from a distance. He was breathing. He could feel his own chest moving, in and out, the mechanical fact of it. He looked at his hands on the table, and they were flat and still, and that was the entirety of his control right now, that his hands were flat and still. Kaelor. Get out, he said. I'm not leaving you alone with... Ronan? He looked up. His voice was something he didn't recognize, not the cold he'd built and used and relied on for 19 years. Something underneath that cold. The thing the cold had been built to contain. Give me 5 minutes. Ronan looked at him for a long moment. Then he picked up the documents, left the fourth one on the table, and walked out. Kaelor stood in the empty room. He looked at the signature. He thought about his mother's face, which he hadn't let himself think about in 20 years, because thinking about her face meant thinking about the doorway, and the doorway meant thinking about the version of himself that had stood in it. And that version of himself was something he'd bricked up behind 7,000 miles of war and 19 years of building an empire that ran on fear. Because fear was reliable, and loyalty was not, and attachment was the mechanism by which everything you protected got taken from you. He'd built an empire on that lesson. And the man who'd taught it to him had been sitting at his right hand ever since. The door opened. Not Ronan. He knew the footsteps. Celine stopped inside the doorway. She looked at him and then looked at the document on the table and read enough of it to understand the shape of what had happened. She didn't say she was sorry. He was grateful for that. The twins are settled, she said. Your men have the walls. She came into the room and stopped across the table from him. Talk to me. Malrek killed my mother. He heard himself say it in the flat, cold voice he used for campaign facts. And underneath that flatness, something was moving that was enormous and old, and had been sealed for 20 years and was now very close to the surface. He positioned her convoy. He fed the location to the rebels. And he stopped. I built my entire life on what I thought that taught me. Celine was quiet. I made myself into something that couldn't be touched, he said. Couldn't be weakened. I cut everything that could be used against me. He looked at her. I cut you. She held his gaze. No flinch. No performed forgiveness. Just the direct gray presence of a woman who had absorbed a great deal of damage and not let it make her smaller. And what he built in you, she said, he's been using for 7 years. The truth of it hit flat and hard. Every war that had run longer than it should. Every rebellion that had fractured in ways that kept the Empire needing Malrek's intelligence. Every decision Kaelor had made from the cold place, from the stone place, from the boy in the doorway place. Malrek had known that place existed because Malrek had created it, and he'd been feeding it ever since. He doesn't know about the children, Kaelor said. He didn't know about them 3 days ago, Celine said carefully. He will now. His men failed. He'll know they're dead, and he'll know you rode north, and he'll begin calculating what that means. Which gives us a short window before he adjusts. Yes. He looked at the document, at the signature. He had spent his adult life making decisions from the cold place, and the cold place had been built on a lie, had been the intended architecture of a man who needed him to be exactly this, isolated, armored, without anchor, without anything he couldn't afford to lose. A king who ran his empire through fear because he'd been taught at 7 years old that love was the knife that got your mother killed. He had been weaponized against himself. He reached out and picked up the document and held it for a moment. Then he folded it carefully and put it in his coat against his chest, where he could feel the shape of it. He looked at Celine. I need you to fight beside me. I know, she said. Not as a hostage I'm protecting, not as a political arrangement. Beside me. She looked at him with 3 years and a burned valley and 2 children sleeping on a garrison cot behind her, and she said, Show me the battle plan. Outside, the winter deepened. In the capital, 300 miles south, Malrek Voss sat in the throne room he'd spent 20 years engineering and waited for word from the north. The word, when it came, would tell him his 8 men were dead. It would tell him the Alpha King had ridden north himself. It would tell him the pieces were moving. What it would not tell him, what he could not have calculated, was the thing that had changed in the garrison room at Redfall, when a king read a 20-year-old signature and felt the cold place crack open and understood, for the first time, what he'd actually been built to be. The Empire was about to learn what Kaelor Draven looked like when he stopped fighting from behind walls. and the man who'd built those walls was not going to be ready for it. The battle plan took 4 hours. Kaelor spread what maps he had across the garrison table, and Celine stood across from him, and they worked it the way two people work a problem when they're past the point of performing confidence at each other. Directly, arguing the weak points openly, neither of them pretending the numbers were better than they were. The numbers were bad. Malrek held the capital with the Eastern Army, 12,000 trained soldiers, the garrison, and whatever mercenary contracts he'd had staged before he moved. 3 noble houses had signed. The others were waiting, and waiting in a civil war meant the same thing it always meant. They'd sign with whoever looked like they were going to win. Kaelor had 24 men at Redfall, and whatever loyalty he could pull from the lords who hadn't yet committed. The Western Rebellion, Celine said, her finger on the map. If Malrek was running it, it doesn't serve him anymore. He's got the capital. The rebellion was a tool for keeping you extended and distracted. Now it's just noise that costs him resources. He'll try to stand it down, Kaelor said, which means the Western rebel commanders suddenly have no patron and no clear enemy. She looked up. Some of them will go home. Some of them will look for the next offer. She held his gaze. You could offer first. He looked at the map, the Western territories. 3 years of men bleeding in the tree lines and the rocks, men fighting a war that Malrek had been feeding from both ends. They'd be fighting beside Imperial soldiers they'd been killing for 3 years. Yes, she said, which is why you'd have to be the one to ask. Not a proxy, not a letter. You. He understood what she was saying, not a strategic appeal, a personal one. An alpha riding into hostile territory and standing in front of men who had every reason to put an arrow in him and asking for something that required them to decide who he actually was rather than what they'd been told he was. He hadn't operated that way since before his mother died. I'll ride west at first light, he said. Ronan, who had been standing against the far wall absorbing all of this with the focused silence of a man building operational plans in his head, said, 3 days to reach the main Western cell commanders. 3 days back. That's a week before you can move on the capital. Then we have a week. Kaelor looked at Celine. Can you hold Redfall? I'll hold what needs holding, she said. He believed her. He rode west with 6 men and no banner. The Western commanders met him with crossbows and suspicion and the particular hostility of people who'd learned to treat unexpected gestures from the Empire as the setup for something worse. He stood in a forest clearing in the second day's gray morning light with weapons aimed at him from 3 directions and said what he needed to say without dressing it in anything strategic. He told them about Malrek, about the coordination evidence, about the revenue feeding their operations from the Imperial Treasury for 3 years, not out of sympathy, but because a rebellion that kept bleeding without resolving served Malrek's positioning better than either a victory or a peace. He told them about his mother. He hadn't planned to tell them that. It came out because it was the truth underneath the truth, and in that clearing with crossbows aimed at his chest, he was done building structures around it. The man who'd positioned her convoy 20 years ago now sat in the Imperial throne room and was using the war he'd engineered to ratify himself as the Empire's protector. The commander of the Western Cell was a woman named Bryn, 40 years old, gray-streaked, missing 2 fingers on her left hand from a skirmish she'd walked away from when other people hadn't. She listened to all of it without expression. Then she said, Why should we believe a word out of your mouth? You shouldn't, he said. Not automatically. He held her gaze. But you've been fighting for 3 years, and your ranks are thinner, and your territory isn't any freer, and the man who's been supplying your intelligence just seized a throne. You can do the math on what that means for your future without me explaining it. She looked at him for a long time. What do you want from us? She said. I want fighters who know the terrain around the capital. I want commanders who can move without supply lines for 10 days. I want people who are angry enough about being used to do something about it. He kept his eyes steady on hers. I can't promise you the empire you wanted 3 years ago. I can promise you a seat at the table when it's rebuilt. Real language in the new compact. Real representation. And if you lose, if I lose, you're no worse off than you are now, and you'll have fought for something true instead of something manufactured. Bryn looked at her lieutenants, a silent exchange that had years of shared history in it. Then she looked back at Kaelor. We ride in 3 days, she said. Don't make me regret it. He rode back to Redfall with 200 Western fighters committed and the specific exhaustion of a man who had just done something he couldn't undo and knew it was right and was terrified of it anyway. The march on the capital took 6 days. Word had moved faster than the army. It always did. And by the third day, 2 of the unsigned noble houses sent riders to meet Kaelor on the road with commitments that were careful and conditional and good enough. By the 5th day, a 3rd house committed fully. Lord Cassie defected from Malrek's declaration with a written apology that Kaelor read once and didn't respond to, and filed under things to deal with after. On the 6th morning, they came over the last ridge, and the capital spread below them in the winter light, gray stone and iron and the distant glint of the river cutting through the lower districts. The Imperial standard flew above the citadel. Not Kaelor's standard. Malrek's new seal, a clean break, the Imperial wolf redesigned with the contamination language stripped from it. The symbol of something that had been waiting a long time to be exactly what it now was. Kaelor sat on his horse at the ridgeline and looked at it and felt the bond at his chest, present and pulling, and realized Celine was riding up beside him. She'd ridden from Redfall with the twins in protected rear guard, against his stated preference and without asking him. He'd accepted it because arguing it with her was a waste of time he didn't have, and because she was right that she belonged in this fight, and he was done making decisions for her under the guise of protecting her. She stopped beside him and looked at the capital. "He'll have prepared for a siege," she said. "He doesn't think I have enough to break one," Kaelor said. "He doesn't know about Bryn's people." "He'll know soon. His scouts have been tracking us since yesterday." "Yes." He looked at the citadel, at the flag, at the walls where he could see the glint of garrison soldiers positioned in numbers that confirmed Malrek had staged this carefully, had known an attack was coming, and had used the weak to fortify. "He wants me to hesitate at the walls. Wants the noble houses watching to see me stop and recalculate and look uncertain." He looked at Celine. "He's built his legitimacy on the argument that I'm compromised. The longer this looks even, the more that argument holds. So don't hesitate," she said. "So don't hesitate." He turned to Ronan. "Signal Bryn. Western approach. As planned. We move in 2 hours." The battle for the capital broke open at midday. Bryn's fighters hit the western gate from the tree line with the specific ferocity of people who'd been angry for 3 years and had finally found a target that deserved it. The garrison on that wall had been staged for a frontal military assault, not for the kind of terrain-educated chaos that 3 years of guerrilla fighting produced. The western gate fell in 40 minutes. Kaelor came through the main approach with his own force simultaneously, and the math that Malrek had calculated, the careful balance of garrison and wall and Eastern Army positioning, started coming apart at the points where it had assumed Kaelor would behave like the man Malrek had spent 7 years shaping him to be. That man would have held at the walls, would have measured the odds, would have protected himself first and calculated the cost of each move from behind the armor. Kaelor rode through the breach at the head of his soldiers. Not a symbolic gesture, a tactical choice and a true one. The army moved faster and harder when the man asking them to die for something was dying for it in the same breath. He'd known this about war since he was 19 years old, and had never fully let himself use it because using it required caring about the outcome in a way that could be seen. And being seen caring about something was the mechanism by which things got taken from you. He cared now. Visibly, completely, at full gallop through a broken gate with blood on his face from a graze at the wall and his wolf running right at the edge of the shift. The Eastern Army met them in the main avenue, and the fighting went close and brutal, the kind of street battle where tactics collapsed into individual decisions made in half seconds. And the difference between alive and dead was usually which direction you were looking. He fought through it with Ronan at his left and 2 of his best soldiers on his right, and the sounds of the city around him. Shouts, steel, horses, the specific percussion of a battle in stone streets. He was 3 blocks from the citadel when the Eastern Army's center broke. Not from his force. From inside, a section of the Eastern Army turning on its own flanks, the soldiers who'd served under Kaelor's direct command for years and had spent the last week watching Malrek's seal go up over the building they'd pledged their service to, and had made a decision about what that meant. The break spread. It moved through the army's formation the way a fracture moved through ice, fast once it started, finding every weakness simultaneously. Malrek's carefully staged force came apart in 20 minutes, and what was left was the garrison soldiers, the personal guard, and the citadel walls. Kaler stood in the avenue with blood drying on his jaw and his horse lost somewhere behind him, and the citadel gates 200 meters ahead, and looked at what remained. He looked at Celine, who had come through the avenue fighting with a precision that had stopped his own soldiers cold twice when they'd caught sight of her. White wolf form and back again, fluid and devastating, covering ground with the kind of efficiency that didn't come from training alone. She was breathing hard, standing with a blade she'd taken from a fallen soldier, looking at the citadel. "He's inside," she said. "Yes." "He won't come out." "No." Kaler looked at the gates. Thick iron, crossbarred from the inside. 100 garrison soldiers on the walls above. A direct assault would cost him 50 men minimum. He thinks he can hold until the unsigned houses make a final decision. If he holds the citadel long enough, the political math might still move. "Then we need to change the math," Celine said. He looked at her. She looked back at him. Then she turned and looked at where Ronan had positioned the rear guard at the avenue's far end, and where, under heavy escort, nowhere near the fighting, exactly where they'd agreed, two small shapes stood watching the citadel with white hair catching the winter light. He understood what she was saying. "No," he said. "Kaler, they're 3 years old." "I know how old they are." Her voice was even, not pushing, stating. "I also know what they did in the valley when the assassins came, what their howl did to those men before I could reach them." She held his gaze. "They're not ordinary children. They never have been. And they know it. They shouldn't have to be weapons. I'm not asking them to be weapons. I'm saying they exist, and the houses watching this battle don't know what the White Wolf bloodline actually is, because I've kept them hidden for 3 years." She turned to face him fully. "Let them see. Let every lord and soldier and house representative watching this battle see what the White Wolf line produced. Not as a threat, as a truth." Her gray eyes were direct and clear. Malrek built his declaration on contamination. Let them see what he called contaminated. He was quiet for a long moment. The citadel wall above them held garrison soldiers who were watching the avenue, watching him, watching Celine, reporting everything they saw back inside. He thought about the 7 years of being exactly what someone else needed him to be. The walls he'd built. The cold place. The boy in the doorway turned into an engine of conquest that served everyone's purposes but his own. He thought about Lyric asking him directly, in a fire-lit garrison room, "Will you protect us?" "Yes." "Not close to the fight," he said. "Rear of the line, full escort. And the moment anything moves toward them, I handle it." He looked at his mate. The words settled in his chest without armor around it for the first time. Just the fact of her present and real, and standing in a battle-torn avenue with someone else's blood on her coat and her eyes steady on his. "All right," he said. "Bossen." Ronan brought the twins forward. Soren walked with his chin up and his hands loose at his sides, reading the battle-damaged avenue the way he read everything. Cataloging, assessing, missing nothing. Lyric walked beside him with her hand in his, and she looked at the citadel with the specific focus of a child who had decided something. They stopped at the edge of the open ground before the gates. They were small. 3 years old, white-haired, standing in a burned and broken avenue with the winter light making them look somehow luminous against the gray stone. Every soldier in the avenue had gone quiet. The garrison soldiers on the citadel walls were leaning forward. Kaler crouched beside his son. Eye level, close. Soren looked at him. "You don't have to do anything," Kaler said. "We're not asking you to fight." Soren looked at the citadel, then back at his father with those clear, serious eyes. "Mama says we're supposed to be what we are," he said, "not what's convenient." Kaler looked at his son for a long moment. 3 years old and already cutting to the center of things. He didn't know whether to be terrified or proud. He settled on both. "Yeah," he said. "She's right." He stood up. The twins stepped forward together, Lyric's hand still in Soren's, and something in the air changed. Kaler felt it before he saw it. A pressure change. A frequency beneath audible sound, the same quality the bond had, but amplified and external and building. The soldiers around him felt it too. He saw it move through the avenue, men and wolves going still with the instinct response to something ancient and undeniable. The twins threw their heads back and howled. It wasn't a child sound. It was enormous. It came from somewhere deeper than their small bodies should have been able to reach, and it built on itself, layering harmonics that had no right to exist in human-shaped throats, and it hit the citadel walls like a physical force. The garrison soldiers on the walls stumbled. Some of them dropped to one knee without choosing to. Horses in the avenue went down on their haunches. Kaelor braced against it and felt it move through his own chest like a hand reaching in and gripping something fundamental. The howl lasted 11 seconds. Then it stopped, and the silence that followed it was the silence of a city holding its breath. High above, on the citadel wall, a garrison soldier dropped his weapon. Then another. Then 6 more. The iron-barred gates shuddered, not from force, from the inside, someone removing the bar. The gates swung open, and standing in the gap, alone, in the formal war advisor's coat that now looked like a costume he'd put on too long ago and couldn't figure out how to take off, was Malrek Voss. He looked at the twins. For the first time in 7 years, Kaelor saw something move through Malrek's face that wasn't controlled, wasn't filed, wasn't the output of strategic calculation. Something that looked like the recognition of a man who had planned for the 20 scenarios he could imagine and had just encountered the one he couldn't. He looked past the children at Kaelor. "You brought them here," Malrek said. His voice was still even, still composed, the performance running on muscle memory alone. "To a battle." "No," Kaelor said. "They're here because they exist, because you spent 7 years trying to prevent them from existing, and they exist anyway, and every house and soldier and witness in this city is seeing them right now." He walked forward. The distance between them closed, 50 meters, 40, 30. He kept his eyes on Malrek's face and watched the calculation running behind it, and watched it running out of moves. "I know about Vale Ridge." Something went out of Malrek's face, just out, like a held breath released. The composed surface was still there, but something behind it had changed, some deep structural element that the surface had been resting on. "That was a long time ago," Malrek said. "I know." Kaelor stopped 10 feet away, close enough to see the detail in the man's eyes, the specific quality in them now. Not fear exactly, something more complex. A man looking at the consequence of 20 years of work arriving all at once. "Tell me why." "You know why." "Tell me anyway." Malrek was quiet for a moment. Around them the avenue had gone absolutely still. Hundreds of soldiers, wolves, nobles, witnesses, all of them holding the same breath. He looked at Kaelor with the eyes of a man who had run out of strategy and arrived at the last available thing, which was the truth. "Your mother was going to make peace with the North," he said. "Real peace. Compact integration, the wild clans brought inside the line. She was going to change the architecture of this entire empire. Less war, more negotiation, fewer conflicts requiring intelligence advisors and war councils." He said it without apology, without performance, just the fact of it. "I had built a career on this empire staying exactly as broken as it was. She was going to fix it." "So you killed her?" "So I killed her." No hesitation, no flinch. "And I gave you the lesson that made you into what you became. Because what you became needed exactly the kind of advisor I am." The words landed in the open air of the broken avenue. Kaelor looked at the man who had killed his mother and shaped his grief into an instrument and run his empire for 7 years through the wound. He felt the rage of it, enormous, cellular, something that had been sealed for 20 years finally finding its dimensions. He also felt, with unexpected and devastating clarity, that Malrek was right. What he'd become had needed exactly this. The Cold King built on a manufactured grief, running an empire on fear because someone had needed him to and had engineered the reason. The man standing in front of him had built him, and the man standing in front of him was going to answer for it. "Surrender the citadel," Kaelor said. Malrek looked at him, at the twins behind him, at Celine standing with her blade and her steady eyes, at the avenue full of soldiers who had already decided. He looked at the garrison on the walls above, and Kaelor looked too, and saw the weapons down, the postures changed, the men and women who had just heard a howl that went through every layer of conditioning and touched something underneath and had made their own calculation about what that meant. Malrek looked back at Kaelor. "The Empire won't survive without someone who knows how to run its wars," he said. "The Empire is done running wars," Kaelor said. "Surrender, or don't." The winter light fell across the open ground between them. Somewhere behind Kalor, the twins were quiet, Lyric's hand in Soren's, both of them watching. Celine was at his left flank, Ronan at his right. The entire broken city holding still around a 10-foot gap between a king and the man who had made him and nearly unmade everything else. Malrek reached slowly into his coat. Kalor's soldiers moved. Weapons up, immediate, the combat tension snapping back into every body in the avenue. Malrek drew out a sealed document, held it up where it could be seen, looked at Kalor with something in his eyes that was tired and clear and final. The Eastern Army's command codes, he said. Full surrender authorization. He held it out. You'll need them. Some of those commanders will only stand down for the sealed order. Kalor looked at the document in his hand. He stepped forward and took it. They stood 18 inches apart. Malrek's face was close enough that Kalor could see the lines in it, the specific weariness of a man who'd been running a very long play and had come to the end of it. One thing, Malrek said, very quietly, just between them. She would have been proud of you today. A pause. Not the king you were before, the one you are right now. Kalor looked at him. He didn't answer. He stepped back and looked at Ronan. Take him. Ronan moved. Malrek didn't resist. He stood with his hands at his sides while Ronan's soldiers flanked him and walked him back through the citadel gates, and he went quietly, and he didn't look back. Kalor stood in the avenue with the surrender document in his hand, and the citadel gates opened before him, and the Empire's capital spread out in every direction, broken and winter gray and still, finally, unnervingly still, after 3 years of bleeding. He felt a small hand close around two of his fingers. He looked down. Soren stood beside him, looking at the open gates with his father's assessment and his mother's eyes, his white hair loose in the cold wind. Is it over? The boy said. Kalor looked at the citadel, at the flag he was going to take down in the next 10 minutes and replace with something that would need to mean something different from everything it had meant before. At the work ahead, not war work, the harder work, the kind without clear battle lines or measurable victories. At the empire that had been built on his mother's death and his manufactured grief and 19 years of cold, and what it was going to take to make it into something else. He looked down at his son. No, he said. The hard part's just starting. Soren considered this with his characteristic 3-year-old gravity. Then Lyric appeared on Kalor's other side and took his other hand without asking permission, and Celine came to stand beside him, and the four of them stood together at the edge of the open gates while the Empire waited to find out what kind of king walked through them. He took the flag down himself. No ceremony, no assembled court, no formal proclamation read aloud to a gathered crowd. He climbed the citadel's main tower alone in the late afternoon while his soldiers secured the lower floors and the city outside, settled into the specific quiet that follows the end of a battle. Exhausted, uncertain, not yet ready to be called peace. He climbed the stairs he'd climbed 1,000 times and came out onto the high platform where the wind hit him full in the face and pulled at his coat, and he looked at Malrek's seal snapping in the cold air above him. He reached up and took it down with his hands. The fabric was good quality. Someone had commissioned it properly, had it made with the attention to detail of a man who intended it to fly for a long time. Kalor held it for a moment, feeling the weight of it, and then walked to the wall edge and let it go. The wind took it immediately, spinning it out over the city's rooftops, and he watched it until it disappeared, and then he stood with his hands on the cold stone and looked out over the capital and breathed. He stayed there for a long time. Below, the city was beginning to move again the way cities moved after their holding breath ran out. People at windows, voices in the streets. The cautious resumption of all the small necessary activities that wars interrupted and lives required. He watched it without trying to read it strategically. Just watched. He'd spent 19 years looking at everything as a variable in an equation. Every person, every house, every relationship a piece on a board that needed to be understood in terms of what it could do to the structure he was maintaining. He'd built that habit in a doorway when he was 7 years old and had never once questioned whether it was the only available response to what he'd seen there. He'd just built and built and built until the building was the whole of him and he couldn't remember what had been there before. What had been there before was a boy who had watched his father laugh with his mother over something small and domestic at a dinner table, and had not yet learned to call that a vulnerability. He stood on the wall and let himself remember that. Not the doorway, before the doorway. It hurt in a way that was clean. The council chamber that evening held 12 people instead of the 40 that full imperial councils required, and every one of those 12 knew they were in the room because Kaelor had made a deliberate decision about who he trusted enough to begin with. Ronan was there. 3 lords who had committed without waiting to see the outcome. Bryn, who had ridden in from the western approach and now sat at the council table with her arms crossed and her missing fingered hand flat on the wood, looking at Kaelor with the assessment of someone who'd placed a bet and wanted to know if it was going to pay out. 2 of the Eastern Army's senior commanders who had broken from Malrek's formation. Thelene. He told them what he wanted to build, not what he was going to command, what he wanted to build and why, and what it would require from all of them, and what he was willing to give in exchange. He talked for an hour without notes and answered every question directly, and didn't manage any of it the way he'd managed councils before. The careful positioning, the pre-staged outcomes, the information selectively distributed to move people where he needed them, without them knowing they were being moved. He just talked. Bryn asked the hardest question. She asked it near the end, when the structural proposals were done and the room was processing. Why should any of us believe this is real and not just you saying what you need to say to get the throne stable? The room went quiet, in the way rooms went quiet when someone said the true thing. Kaelor looked at her. You shouldn't believe it because I said it, he said. You should believe it when you see it in what I actually do. I can't give you anything better than that. He held her gaze. If I revert, you'll know. And you'll have everything you need to build a case because the compact language we're writing tonight is going to have real teeth and real accountability, and you're going to be one of the people holding those teeth. Bryn looked at him for a long moment. All right, she said. Let's write it. They worked until past midnight. The language was hard-won and argued at every clause and came out better for it. When it was done, Kaelor looked at what was on the table and recognized it as something genuinely different from any compact document in the Empire's history, and felt the specific weight of that, not pride, something more sober than pride, the feeling of a man who understood exactly how much the words on paper and the world they described were not yet the same thing, and how long the distance between them would take to close. He found Selene on the Citadel's eastern wall an hour before dawn. She was sitting on the stone with her knees drawn up and her white hair loose, looking at the dark city below. He'd known where she was without looking, had known since the council ended, and she'd left the chamber quietly without saying where she was going. He'd given her the hour and then followed. He sat beside her. They were quiet for a while. The city below was dark and still, the worst of the battle damage visible even in the faint pre-dawn light. Burned sections, broken stone, the specific geography of a place that had been fought through and would need time to forget it. The twins are asleep, she said. I know. I checked. She looked at him sideways. Something moved in her face. Not quite a smile, something more complex than that. The expression of a person receiving information that costs something to receive because it means adjusting a position you've held for a long time. I owe you something, he said. You owe me several things. Yes. He looked at the city. I'm going to start with the truth. He felt her attention shift toward him, the quality of her stillness changing. I knew what the bond was when I felt it. From the first moment, I knew it completely. He kept his eyes on the dark rooftops. I rejected you because you were real, because the bond was real, because everything I'd built required nothing to be real, required every connection to be strategic, manageable, something I could measure and control. He paused. You were the one thing I couldn't manage, so I threw you away and called it strategy. Selene was very still beside him. I told myself you'd be fine, he said. I told myself you were strong enough. I used that as a reason instead of what it was, which was a lie I needed to believe so I could keep being what I'd made myself into. He looked at her now. You were alone in the frozen north for 3 years, carrying and raising my children, and I knew... Some part of me knew something was different with the bond, knew what it might mean, and I didn't come because coming would have required me to stop being the thing I'd decided to be. She looked at him. He couldn't read her expression in the pre-dawn dark, and he didn't try to. He just held her gaze and let her look at whatever was there. I'm not asking you to forgive that, he said. I'm asking you to let me spend whatever time I have left proving it won't happen again. Not because you need my protection, not because of the political architecture of what an empress beside an alpha king means for the compact. He looked at her steadily. Because you're my mate, and I spent 3 years pretending that was a problem, and I'm done." The silence between them stretched out long and cold, and the city below didn't move, and somewhere in the citadel behind them, his children were asleep under guard, and the empire was a broken thing that needed hands willing to do the patient work of rebuilding. "You hurt me," she said. Not as an accusation, as a fact she was setting on the table between them because it belonged there. "I know. Not just the rejection, the public nature of it, the way you made it official and formal and legible so that everyone would know I had been found insufficient." Her voice was even. "I spent a month after I left not knowing if I was going to be able to get up in the mornings." He didn't say he was sorry, because sorry was thin, and this was not a thin thing. He said, "Tell me what you need." She looked at him for a long moment. "I need you to stop making decisions about my life without consulting me," she said. "I need the compact language to reflect that what I hold is real authority, not a ceremonial title. I need our children to grow up knowing their mother's power is not contingent on their father's willingness to grant it." She held his gaze. "And I need you to say something true to me right now that you have never said to anyone." He understood what she was asking. Not a declaration, not a political commitment. Something smaller and therefore harder. The thing underneath the architecture. He looked at her and he said, "I was afraid of you because you saw me. Not the king, not the empire. The boy in the doorway who never learned to get up from that floor because he turned it into stone instead." His voice came out rough and he let it. "You saw that in the first conversation we had, and I threw you away because I couldn't let it be seen. I have been afraid of being seen my entire adult life, and you were the first person who looked directly at it without flinching." He paused. "That's what I've never said to anyone." Celine looked at him. The pre-dawn light was just beginning to change at the eastern horizon, the darkness thinning toward gray, and in that thin light he could see her face clearly. The steady gray eyes, the composure she'd built from 3 years of hard solitude and necessity, and underneath it something that had been waiting to be said back to him by someone who understood the weight of the words. "I know," she said. "I knew then." She held his gaze. "That's why I came back." He reached out and put his hand over hers on the cold stone. She turned her hand over and held it. They sat on the wall as the dawn came up over the capital, slow and winter pale, and neither of them said anything else for a long time, and it was enough. Malric's trial took 3 weeks. Kaylor insisted on the full process: witnesses, evidence, formal examination of the 20 years of record. Not for Malric's benefit, for the Empire's. The people living under its compact needed to see the thing that had been running underneath their wars and their taxes and their dead examined in open daylight, needed to be able to look at the whole shape of it and understand it and make an informed accounting of what had been done in the Empire's name. Malric sat through all of it without visible distress. He answered questions with the same professional evenness he'd brought to every council session for 7 years, and in doing so inadvertently made the case against himself more thoroughly than any prosecutor could have, because the evenness itself was the evidence, the complete absence of remorse in a man who had looked at an empire's worth of suffering and found it operationally acceptable. On the last day of the trial, Kaylor spoke. He spoke about his mother. He did it in the plain, flat language of someone who had rehearsed it many times and then abandoned the rehearsal and was saying it raw. He described what she'd been building before she died. The peace framework, the Northern Compact, the empire she'd been trying to make before the man sitting across the chamber had decided her vision was an obstacle to his career. He told the chamber what it would have meant, what those 30 years of avoidable war had cost in lives, in territory, in the grinding human damage of a conflict that was always one careful negotiation away from resolution. He didn't editorialize, he just put the true cost where it could be counted. Then he looked at Malrec directly and said, "You built me. You built me into what you needed me to be, and you ran the empire through my grief for 20 years. I want you to understand that I know that completely. And I want you to understand that it ends here because I choose for it to end here, not because of what you deserve, but because carrying it is something I am no longer willing to do." He sentenced him to permanent exile, not execution. Exile. Several of the lords thought he was being weak. He heard the murmuring and let it happen. He understood the instinct. An empire ran on clear demonstration of consequences, and death was the clearest demonstration available. But he had spent 19 years governing through fear through the logic that the most extreme response was always the most powerful one, and he was done with that as a philosophy. What Malrek had built in him had been built specifically through violence and loss. Answering it with more violence was the circular road back to the same place. Let him live in exile knowing the empire his manipulation had tried to create was being dismantled piece by piece. That was a different kind of consequence, a longer one. Malrek left the capital on a gray morning, 2 guards, and a horse, and the closed face of a man who had run out of board. He didn't look back when they passed the outer gate. Kaelor watched him go from the same window where he'd watched delegations arrive on the morning Selene walked into his life, and when Malrek's party disappeared into the road's distance, he stood there a moment longer and then turned away and did not think about it again. The reconstruction took months. It was not clean work. Nothing about rebuilding a thing that had been constructed wrong from the foundation was clean. It required tearing down portions that functioned well enough on their own, but were embedded in corrupt systems, required having the same argument about specific compact language 12 times, with 12 different lords who had 12 different reasons for wanting the old phrasing kept. Required sitting across from people he didn't trust and finding the pieces of them that were workable and building on those pieces honestly, because the alternative was to govern through suspicion indefinitely, and suspicion was just fear-wearing administrative clothing. Selene sat beside him at every council, not ceremonially, working, arguing, catching the angles he missed because she came at problems from a different architecture than he did, an architecture built from 3 years of running a hidden settlement with no institutional support and no margin for error. She had a grasp of practical consequence that cut through political abstraction the way a blade cut through rope, and the lords who had initially performed skepticism about her authority stopped performing it roughly 6 weeks in when it became clear she was simply better at the parts of governance they cared about than most of them were. She didn't become empress by his grant. She claimed it, stood in the council chamber in front of all 12 lords and the assembled compact representatives, and made the case for the White Wolf bloodline's historical standing in imperial law, a case she'd clearly been building in her head for some time, annotated and precise, that left no procedural gap for anyone to use as an exit. She claimed the title on its own merit, from the lineage, from the work she'd already done, and then looked at Kaelor across the council table and said, "I'm not asking for this. I'm notifying the council of what is." He looked at her and kept his expression neutral and said, "The council notes it," and felt something in his chest move in a way that had nothing to do with strategy and everything to do with watching someone he'd once tried to diminish take exactly the space they were owed. The lords noted it. They noted it with the specific attentiveness of people who were recalibrating very fast, us. Soren and Lyric were told the full truth the spring they turned 4, not a child's version, not a managed account designed to land softly. Selene had been clear about this. They were not ordinary children, and they had not had ordinary childhoods, and treating them like fragility they didn't possess was a form of lying, and she was done lying to protect feelings that could handle the truth. So they sat in the sunlit room at the top of the eastern wing, the room Selene had claimed as her own because it had the best light and the widest view, and Kaelor and Selene told them. The rejection, the 3 years in the north, the assassins, the civil war, what their howl had done at the Capitol gate, all of it. Lyric listened with the focused stillness she brought to important information. When it was done, she looked at her father and said, "You were scared." "Yes," he said. "Of what?" He looked at his daughter, 4 years old, gray eyes steady, the same direct quality she'd had since she was old enough to have a posture. "Of how much it mattered," he said. "Of what it would mean if something happened to it." She considered this with the same gravity she'd used at the garrison campfire when she'd asked whether he would protect them. "That's why people do bad things," she said. "They're scared, and they do the bad thing instead of the scared thing." He looked at her. "The scared thing is harder," she said. "The bad thing is easier because it feels like control." Selene was very still across from him. He looked at his 4-year-old daughter, who had apparently arrived at a more precise understanding of his psychological architecture than he'd managed by 40, and said, "Yes, that's exactly right." Lyric nodded, satisfied, and went back to the drawing she'd been working on. Soren, who had been quiet through all of it in the manner of a child processing something large and slow, looked at Kaelor from his side of the low table. "Are you scared now?" he asked. Kaelor thought about the honest answer. "Every day," he said. different things. There's a lot that can still go wrong. Soren looked at him with his father's eyes in his mother's face. But you're doing it anyway. Yes. The boy seemed to find this acceptable. He went back to his own drawing. Outside the window, the spring was coming up through the last of the winter gray, pale green on the hillsides, the river running higher and faster with the melt. The capital below was showing its repair work, new stone in the broken sections, the sound of construction carrying up on the warm air. Kalor sat in the sunlit room with his family and listened to the sound of the city putting itself back together and did not try to manage the feeling of it. There was one last thing. He went back to the northern valley alone in late spring. No soldiers, no formal purpose. He rode the road north he'd ridden at a panicked gallop 6 months ago and came to the valley in 3 quiet days and stood at the ridge where he'd first seen the settlement below. The burned building was a foundation now. The clearing had been cleaned of its evidence. The valley was empty, the settlement abandoned, and the spring coming in through the trees made it look almost peaceful. He climbed down. He walked the clearing slowly. He stood in the center of it and looked at where the fire had been and where the bodies had been, and where Celine had stood in her white wolf form over 2 small shapes with her back to the tree line and blood on her shoulder, and her eyes already finding him on the ridge. He'd arrived because the bond had finally pulled hard enough and late enough that showing up had cost him everything it cost. He'd arrived to a woman who had every reason not to trust him, and 2 children who had every reason not to know him, and he'd stood in this clearing and asked to be allowed to do the thing he should have been doing for 3 years. She'd let him. He didn't know, standing in that valley on a spring afternoon, whether he would ever fully understand what that had required from her. The precise internal accounting of it, the weighing of what she was owed against, what the children needed against what she could afford to hope for from a man who had already demonstrated exactly who he was under pressure. He wasn't sure he had the right to understand it fully. It wasn't his internal accounting to possess. What he understood was the weight of the gift. You could build walls that kept everything out and call it safety and run an empire on the cold and the distant and the managed. And for a while the walls held, and for a while the cold was enough. And then the walls showed you what they'd actually cost, which was everything that needed warmth to live. His mother had known that. She'd been building the other kind of empire, the one where the bonds were real and the pacts meant something because the people making them could be seen clearly and still chosen. She'd been building it at the cost of her life, and the cost had been paid, and then her son had taken the grief of it and turned it into the worst version of what she'd fought against. He didn't know if that was repairable in 1 generation. He didn't know if what he and Celine were building would hold, if the compact language would survive the first hard test, if the lords who'd recalibrated under pressure would hold their recalibration when the pressure eased. He didn't know if he was going to be good at this, at the patience of it, the daily accounting of it, the requirement to be seen making mistakes and acknowledging them rather than building new walls around them. He knew he was going to try. That was the thing his mother had known that the boy in the doorway had taken 20 years to learn. Strength wasn't the absence of the thing that could hurt you. Strength was the full knowledge of it, the complete understanding of how much damage was possible, and the decision to stay present and try anyway. He stood in the valley for a long time. The spring moved through the trees around him, unhurried, indifferent to empire and grief, and the long work of making something true. Then he walked back to his horse and rode south, toward the capital, toward his family, toward the work. The empire was not yet what it needed to be. Neither was he. Both of them were trying. That, in the end, was the only answer that held weight. Not the crowns or the howls that dropped armies to their knees, or the compact language argued to sharpness at midnight tables. Just the daily decision to face the damage clearly and build anyway. To stop running the cold calculation and let the real cost of things be real. To choose, each morning, to be the kind of man his children could look at directly and not find a wall where a person should be. He rode into the capital as the afternoon light came long and gold across the rooftops, and Celine was at the outer gate because she'd known when to expect him, and the twins came running from somewhere behind her in a chaos of white hair and small feet and noise, and he dismounted and caught them both and stood in the warm evening light with his arms full and his chest open and the empire waiting around him like a question he'd finally found the courage to answer honestly. It wasn't an ending. It was a beginning that had cost everything a beginning should cost. He held on.